The year is 408. The gates of Rome are closed. Outside those walls stands a Gothic king named Alaric, with an army, an ultimatum, and a shopping list. He wants gold, he wants silver, he wants silk and scarlet cloth, and then he wants something that sounds, to modern ears, like a joke. 3,000 pounds of dried berries, not diamonds, not weapons, pepper. The Roman Senate paid it, all of it, because in that moment, those wrinkled little berries weren't a seasoning. They were a currency strong enough to help buy off the fall of an empire. Think about that. You've probably got some of the same stuff on your kitchen counter right now. It cost you a few dollars. 1,500 years ago, it moved fleets, drained treasuries, and ended up inside the nostrils of dead pharaohs. So how did a fruit that grew wild on a single stretch of Indian coastline end up bankrolling barbarian invasions? How did it build empires, then break them? And why did men cross oceans and kill for a plant most of us now grind without thinking? This is the story of the spice that was worth more than gold, and it's stranger than anything you were taught in school. Before we get back to Alaric, and we will faster than you'd think, you need to know one thing about this plant. Pepper doesn't come from a tree, it comes from a vine, Piper nigrum. In the wild, it climbs the trunks of jungle trees in the hot, wet lowlands of southern India, sometimes reaching 30 feet high. The berries grow in long clusters. They start green. They turn red. When you pick them and dry them in the sun, the skin darkens, the surface wrinkles, and you get the little black kernels the whole world knows. For most of human history, that was the traditional way to make a peppercorn. No shortcut, no synthesis. Everyone had to come from a vine growing in one specific corner of the planet. That corner is the Malabar coast, the southwestern edge of India, in what's now the state of Kerala, tucked between the Arabian Sea and a mountain range called the Western Ghats. Rich soil, heavy monsoons, humidity that almost never breaks. It was the main region on Earth where this plant grew wild in enough abundance to matter. The people who lived there figured out how to farm it, not in fields, up in the air. Picture a family in Kerala, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago in the middle of monsoon season. They're planting young pepper vines at the base of jackfruit trees. The tree is alive. The bark is rough. The vine wraps itself around the trunk and climbs. As the vine grows, the family climbs too, cutting harvest-ready clusters by hand from platforms lashed into the branches. This method still exists. You can watch farmers in Kerala doing it today, more or less the same way their ancestors did before Rome was founded. Rain-soaked, up in the canopy, gathering a crop for buyers they will never meet in cities they will never see. The tree gave shade. The vine gave money. Because even back then, this stuff was money. But here's the strange part. The pepper those farmers picked wasn't just staying in India. Somebody was carrying it away. The first proof of that showed up in a place no archaeologist expected. Inside a pharaoh's face. In 1213 BCE, the pharaoh Rameses II died. He had ruled Egypt for 66 years. He had built temples, cities, and armies. He was, at the time, arguably the most powerful man in the known world. When his body was mummified, the priests followed a careful ritual. They removed the brain. They removed the organs. They preserved the flesh with resins and oils. And then, in a detail that would stun archaeologists 3,000 years later, they filled his nostrils with something. Peppercorns. Actual black peppercorns, stuffed inside the nose of the dead king of Egypt. Nobody knows exactly why. The best guesses are ritual, preserving the shape of the pharaoh's nose, or letting him smell something sweet in the afterlife. What matters is what it means. For those peppercorns to be in that mummy, someone had to move them nearly 3,000 miles from the Malabar coast to the Nile, across oceans, deserts, and hostile borders. Long before the compass, long before written maps of the region. Somebody was running that route anyway, probably Arab traders sailing dhows across the Arabian Sea, then hauling cargo overland through Persia and Arabia. No one bothered to write the details down, but the pepper in Ramesses' nose is the receipt. 32 centuries ago, someone somewhere already understood a truth that would shape the next 3,000 years of human history. Pepper was worth the journey. And once Rome got a taste of it, that journey became an obsession. The Greeks knew pepper. Aristotle wrote about it. Hippocrates used it as medicine. But it stayed rare, and it stayed for the rich. A curiosity, not a habit. Then Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, and Egypt gave Rome something it had never possessed before: direct access to the Indian Ocean. The Nile ran south, the Red Sea ran east toward Arabia, and, past it, India. Roman fleets could now reach the source themselves, and they moved fast. According to the Greek geographer Strabo, roughly 120 Roman ships sailed for the Malabar coast every single year, riding the summer monsoon east and the winter monsoon back. Storms killed some. Pirates hunted the rest near the Horn of Africa. Fleets vanished with no wreckage and no witnesses. But the ships that made it home could triple their investment, sometimes 10 times it, and that kind of return changes what men are willing to risk. The cargo came ashore at a Red Sea port called Berenice, crossed the desert by camel, floated down the Nile to Alexandria, and traveled by ship to Rome. Where it went into buildings the Romans had a name for: Horia Piperataria, pepper warehouses. That's what they called them, whole warehouses, dedicated to storing pepper. There was an entire quarter of Rome built around this trade: streets, guards, weighing rooms, merchants, and the state took 25% off the top on everything coming in from India. Rome ran a spice tax before it ran most other taxes. Emperors quietly built their budgets around it. So they had the supply, they had the routes, they had the tax revenue. Now the obsession shows up. Rome did not merely import pepper, it developed an appetite so extreme that one surviving book still exposes the scale of it. There is exactly one Roman cookbook that has come down to us. It's called Apicius, sometimes titled De Re Coquinaria. On the subject of cooking, it's a collection of recipes from the Roman elite. 468 recipes to be exact. 349 of them contain pepper. Read that again. Nearly 3 out of every 4 Roman recipes called for the stuff. Not just in savory dishes, not just in meat, it was in sauces, in wine, in vegetables, in fish, in dessert. Yes, dessert. One recipe describes something called dulcia domestica, home sweets. You take dates, remove the pit, stuff them with a nut, roll them in ground pepper and salt, then cook them in honey. Pepper candy. That was actual Roman confectionery. Imagine walking into a modern bakery and finding pepper in the cookies, the cake, and the frosting. Not a pinch. Not a garnish. A defining flavor. That was Rome. And it was expensive. Even at peak importation, a middle-class family's daily pepper cost about a day's laborer wage. If you served pepper at your dinner party, you were signaling wealth, access, and connections. You were saying, I know the right merchants. I control the trade. Watching all of this, Pliny the Elder wrote one of the most damning lines in the history of luxury goods. There is no year, he complained, in which India does not drain the Roman Empire of 50 million sesterces. Over 100 million in today's dollars. Every year, never coming back. Pliny called it the waste of luxury. He couldn't understand why an educated people would pay so much for something that, in his words, has nothing to recommend it either in fruit or berry. He thought his fellow Romans had lost their minds. He was wrong, but he wasn't going to be around to see how wrong. For centuries, Rome had been teaching the world what pepper was worth. In 408, one of those students decided to collect. Alaric was born around the year 360. He grew up on the edges of the Roman world, in a Gothic tribe that had spent generations sometimes fighting Rome, sometimes fighting for it. He had fought in the Roman army himself. He knew how the empire worked. He knew what it valued. And by the time he was in his 40s, he had figured out that Rome was weaker than it looked. In 401, he invaded Italy and was pushed back. In 408, he came again. And this time, nothing stopped him. His army marched south. City after city fell without a fight. By late 408, Alaric's forces stood outside the walls of Rome itself. He didn't attack. He didn't have to. He just blocked the roads, seized the Tiber River, the artery that fed the city, and waited. Inside the walls, panic spread. Food ran out fast. The daily grain allowance was cut in half, then cut again. Then cut to nothing. Roman senators, men who had been born into unimaginable luxury, began starving in their marble homes. Contemporary accounts describe families eating things they wouldn't have fed to dogs a year earlier. Rumors circulated of things worse than that. The historian Zosimus, writing shortly after these events, recorded what happened next. The Senate sent messengers to Alaric to negotiate. Alaric demanded all the gold in the city, all the silver, all the barbarian slaves, freed and turned over to swell his ranks. The Roman messengers asked, timidly, what he would leave the Romans with. His answer, according to the record, was 2 words: your lives. Eventually, a deal was struck. Zosimus lists the ransom precisely: 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 hides dyed scarlet, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. Take a second with that number. 3,000 pounds. More than a metric ton of little dried berries. Enough to fill dozens of large sacks. Weighed, packed, and hauled out of Roman warehouses under Gothic supervision in the middle of a famine. The senators had a hard time coming up with the total. They stripped pagan temples for gold statues. They pried decorations off buildings. And when the treasury still fell short, they started melting the gods themselves. One of the statues they melted down was of Virtus, the Roman goddess of valor. Zosimus wrote that when Virtus went into the furnace, all that remained of Roman valor and intrepidity was totally extinguished. But they paid. Every coin, every yard of cloth, every peppercorn. Alaric lifted the siege and pulled his army back. 2 years later, in August of 410, the negotiations that followed collapsed. He came back and sacked Rome outright. For 3 days, the city burned. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. Historians still argue about whether the sack itself killed the Western Empire or just accelerated its death. What nobody argues about is that the ransom of 408 was one of the moments where the illusion of Roman invincibility publicly cracked. And pepper was in the receipt. Not a footnote, not a curiosity. A specific, negotiated, delivered part of the payment that a barbarian king demanded to spare a superpower. Which raises the question you have probably been asking since minute 1. Why? What did a Gothic warlord want with a ton of dried berries? The clearest answer is portable wealth. Unlike grain, pepper didn't rot. Unlike wine, it didn't spill. Unlike land or livestock, it could be divided into tiny quantities and sold in almost any city in Europe or the Middle East for a fortune. A sack of peppercorns was a bank account you could put on a horse. And in a world where Alaric's people did not yet have a stable homeland or a treasury of their own, that portability mattered enormously. Historians have also suggested a second, more speculative motive that Alaric was thinking beyond raiding, toward founding a Gothic economy that could trade with the wider world. Whether or not that ambition was on his mind, the practical fact is clear enough. He took the pepper because pepper in the early 5th century was one of the safest and most valuable things you could take. Rome was ending, but pepper was just getting started, because the taste, once you have it, does not go away. When Rome fell, the pepper trade didn't. It went into hibernation. In the centuries after 476, Western Europe fractured into small kingdoms. Trade routes shrank. The great Roman fleets stopped sailing for India. For a while, ordinary Europeans forgot what pepper even tasted like, but the memory of it never fully died. When cities regrew and merchants pushed out again, the demand came roaring back, this time at a price worse than ever. By the High Middle Ages, Europeans called pepper black gold. And they meant it. The trade had settled into 2 hands. At one end were Arab merchants who controlled the sea lanes between India and the Middle East and set the wholesale price. At the other end were the Venetians. Venice sat at the top of the Mediterranean like a spider on its web, buying from the Arabs, marking pepper up hard, and shipping it north into Germany, France, and England. Venice didn't control every ship, but it controlled most of the flow, and that was enough. Along the way, every warehouse, every camel driver, every dock worker and every tax collector took a cut. By the time a peppercorn made it from a vine in Kerala to a kitchen in London, it had passed through dozens of middlemen and traveled roughly 6,000 miles. It arrived rare, tiny, and worth its weight in silver. That is not a metaphor. Medieval records show pepper priced by the individual peppercorn, wills that specified pepper as inheritance, ledgers that used it to settle debts. In some German cities, wealthy merchants were nicknamed Pfeffersäcke, pepper sacks, because their fortunes were literally measured in the stuff. Picture a bride's family in 14th century Genoa, carrying a small locked casket of peppercorns to a wedding to satisfy part of the dowry. Picture a debtor in 15th century Bruges, settling a decade of unpaid interest with a single pouch. These were not ceremonial gestures. They were real payments with real weight exchanged for real value. And that's actually where an old piece of English legal language comes from. You may have heard the phrase peppercorn rent. Today it means a token payment, the kind of rent you charge when you don't really want any rent. But that meaning is the fossil of an older one. In medieval accounts, pepper appears as genuine payment because a small quantity of it held its value more reliably than the local coin. Only much later, once pepper became common, did the peppercorn survive purely as a legal symbol of the smallest possible price. The phrase is the last echo of a time when the thing itself was money. A whole class of professionals grew up around this money. In London, in the year 1180, a group of spice merchants formalized themselves into the Guild of Pepperers. They set prices. They tested purity. They calibrated the weights on the scales. If you cheated a customer with adulterated pepper, sand mixed in, or old stock re-dyed, the pepperers came after you. Their symbol was a camel, because pepper still came overland by desert caravan, and the camel was the animal that carried the wealth. That guild still exists today, under a different name. A pepper trading fraternity, running for over 800 years and counting. Before we go further, there's a famous old story about pepper in this period that you may have heard. It's worth killing before we move on. You've probably been told that medieval Europeans used spices, especially pepper, to hide the taste of rotting meat. It sounds plausible. It gets repeated in classrooms and documentaries. The problem is, modern medieval historians have taken it apart. Paul Friedman at Yale, who has written entire books on the medieval spice trade, calls it a plausible-sounding but false story. Here's why it collapses. Pepper was only affordable to the rich. The rich could afford fresh meat. They didn't need to disguise anything. The poor, who couldn't afford fresh meat, also couldn't afford pepper. The equation doesn't work. The real reason Europeans wanted pepper was simpler and more human. It tasted incredible. It made food more interesting. It signaled wealth. It was a way of showing off. That was the whole game. Pepper was luxury for its own sake. And luxury, when you control the supply, becomes leverage. By the 14th century, Venice was making a fortune. Its palaces, its canals, its art, its fleets, a large share of them were pepper money. Then, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. Overland spice routes now ran through hostile territory. Middle Eastern merchants raised their prices. Venetian pepper got more expensive by the month. Historians estimate spice prices in some European cities jumped 300 to 500% in the years that followed. The next power to control pepper was not going to conquer the road. It was going to sail around it. Constantinople's fall didn't begin Portugal's search. It made an existing project urgent. Portuguese kings had already been quietly funding voyages down the coast of Africa for 70 years. Chipping south a little farther with each expedition, drawing better maps, and dreaming of the same goal. If you could round the tip of Africa, you could sail east into the Indian Ocean straight to the pepper fields, cutting out every middleman between Kerala and Lisbon. In 1488, a Portuguese captain named Bartolomeu Dias rounded what is now called the Cape of Good Hope and proved it was possible. His crew was exhausted, his supplies were running out, and he turned back before reaching India. The dream sat half-finished for another decade. Then, in July of 1497, 4 Portuguese ships left Lisbon under a nobleman named Vasco da Gama. He carried roughly 170 men, 3 years of supplies, and instructions from King Manuel I to find the source of the pepper and open a trade route no one else could take. The voyage took 10 months. Da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope. He sailed up the eastern coast of Africa. He picked up a local pilot in Malindi, a port in modern Kenya, who knew the monsoon winds. And on the 20th of May, 1498, his fleet dropped anchor at a beach called Kapadu, near a city called Calicut on the Malabar coast. He had done it. He had opened the first direct sea route from Western Europe to India, the shortcut that Europe had been dreaming about for 1,000 years. The reception was less than triumphant. Calicut was ruled by a king called the Zamorin. He was rich. He was sophisticated. His court hosted Arab traders who dealt in silks, jewels, and gold. The Zamorin had been drinking imported Persian wine, while Da Gama's ancestors were still trying to sail past Morocco. When Da Gama presented his gifts, cheap cloth, coral beads, some sugar, some oil, some honey, the Zamorin's courtiers reportedly laughed. Da Gama had crossed 2 oceans and shown up like a beggar at a king's door. He couldn't negotiate a treaty. He couldn't fill his ships the way he had hoped. Arab merchants inside Calicut, who understood exactly what a European sea route meant for their own business, turned openly hostile. Da Gama bought what pepper and spices he could at inflated prices, loaded his holds, and left in September, ignoring warnings that the monsoon hadn't yet turned. The return trip nearly killed everyone. Scurvy tore through the crew. Gums swelled over teeth. Skin bruised at a touch. His ships were becalmed for months. So many men died that he had to burn one of his own ships. He no longer had enough sailors to man it. His own brother died on the voyage home. When Vasco da Gama finally sailed back into Lisbon in September of 1499, only about 55 of the original 170 men were still alive. But he had come back with a hold full of pepper. And when the accountants tallied the value of his cargo, they reportedly found it was worth roughly 60 times what the expedition had cost. 60 times. Portugal had just discovered that a single successful voyage could pay for 10 failed ones. The whole calculus of European exploration flipped overnight. Da Gama was made Admiral of the Indian Ocean. And here is where his story turns into something darker. The first voyage had proved that pepper could make Portugal rich. The second proved what Portugal was willing to do to control it. Da Gama sailed back to India in 1502 with 20 ships and a completely different attitude. This time he came armed. He bombarded Calicut from the sea. He intercepted a pilgrim ship carrying Muslim families home from Mecca and, according to Portuguese sources themselves, set it on fire with the passengers still aboard. He mutilated captured Arab sailors, cutting off hands, ears, and noses, and sent them ashore as messages to the Zamorin. He forced trade agreements at Cannon Point. That, in the end, is how Portugal broke the Venetian monopoly. Not with better negotiation, not with better goods, with better ships, better cannons, and a willingness to be brutal about a plant. For the next 100 years, Portugal ruled the pepper trade. They built forts along the Malabar coast. They controlled ports in Goa, Cochin, and Ormuz. They made themselves the middleman that Venice used to be, and they got very rich doing it. But Portugal broke one monopoly, and in doing so, accidentally taught 2 new rivals exactly how to replace it. In London, in December of 1600, a group of English merchants convinced Queen Elizabeth I to grant them a royal charter. They called themselves the East India Company. Pepper was, from day one, their #1 target. 2 years later, in 1602, the Dutch did the same thing on a larger scale, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, the world's first true multinational corporation. It could raise its own army, it could sign its own treaties, it could wage its own wars, and it did all 3 ruthlessly for 2 centuries. If you want to know what wage its own wars meant for the people producing the pepper, look at the Malabar coast in the 17th century. The VOC didn't just buy pepper. It forced Kerala growers into fixed-price contracts at rates far below what free buyers had once offered. Farmers who tried to sell to other buyers had their crops seized. In 1663, the VOC took the Portuguese fortress at Cochin and used it to enforce a pepper monopoly across the coast. dictating prices to the descendants of the same farmers whose great-grandparents had once freely sold to Arab, Chinese, and Portuguese traders alike. In the Banda Islands, further east, the same company had already massacred and enslaved most of the population to control another spice, nutmeg. The pattern was consistent. A vine was worth more than the people who grew it. The Europeans were winning control of the trade, and in doing so, they were destroying the very scarcity that had made pepper valuable. More ships, more routes, more competing sellers. And when supply climbs and rivals cut each other's throats, prices come down. By the 1600s, pepper had already become cheaper than at any point in 1,000 years. By the 1700s, it was affordable to the European middle class. By the 1800s, working families kept a pepper mill in the kitchen. Competition achieved what no emperor could. It turned black gold into a kitchen staple. The substance that had once ransomed a superpower quietly walked into every home in Europe, then in every home in the Americas, then in every home on Earth. Within a few generations, most people had no idea that ships had been sunk for it, that popes had preached over it, or that a Gothic king had once demanded a metric ton of it to spare a starving city. The spice that had shaped the world just became normal, which, when you think about it, might be the most remarkable part of the whole story. There is one last twist. The final pepper capital of the world today is not Rome, or Venice, or Lisbon, or Amsterdam, or London, or even Kerala. It's Vietnam, the country that once had a near monopoly on the spice. The coast where the vine first grew wild is now barely in the top 5 global producers. The number 1 producer, by a very wide margin, is a country that grew almost no pepper at all a generation ago. In the 1980s, Vietnam produced almost nothing. In the 1990s, government policy pushed pepper as a cash crop. By the 2000s, Vietnamese farmers were supplying roughly a third of the world's pepper, and by 2024, their exports had crossed $1 billion a year. Most of the pepper on American shelves right now comes from farms in the Central Highlands, on land that was scrub and coffee just a few decades ago. That's how fast a spice can change hands. That's how quickly a plant can shift the fortunes of a country. And that is the pattern the whole story of pepper follows. From the Malabar coast to Egypt, from Egypt to Rome, from Rome to Venice, from Venice to Lisbon, from Lisbon to Amsterdam and London, from London to Vietnam. Every time the story of pepper seems settled, someone finds a way to change the map. Which brings us back to a Gothic king outside the walls of Rome. The year is 408. The gates are closed, Alaric is waiting, he demands 3,000 pounds of pepper. At the time, that was a fortune worth threatening an empire over. Today, 3,000 pounds of pepper would cost you a few $1,000s. You could order it online. It would ship from Vietnam. It would arrive at your house in about a week. That's the whole story, hidden inside a single number. Empires that controlled pepper, Rome, Venice, Portugal, the Dutch and English East India companies, grew rich, then complacent, then were replaced. Their forts crumbled, their fleets rusted, their monopolies collapsed, and every single time the vine kept growing, somewhere, in someone else's soil, waiting for the next chapter. That vine is what you're actually reaching for the next time you touch the pepper mill on your kitchen counter. Every twist of that grinder releases a plant that once ransomed emperors, launched fleets, financed the first corporations, and helped drive Europe to reach across the world. You're holding a piece of the plant that helped build the modern economy. For less than the price of a coffee. That, more than any of the sieges or voyages or executions in this story, might be the strangest fact of all. If this kind of story is what you came here for, subscribe. And if you want another common thing that reshaped human history in a way no one taught you, the video on your screen right now is exactly that. The story of a drink and the civilization it built.